It's time now to welcome in once again to the show college basketball expert by the numbers. He is an analytics guru. He is Evan Miyakawa back on BYU Sports Nation. Evan, how are you this morning?
I'm good, and this is the time of year that I love to be talking college basketball more than anything. We've got less than a month from March, and so it's a great time of year right now.
Let's go. Okay, speaking of BYU basketball, by the numbers, beating Kansas by 34 and then surviving at Arizona. What kind of jump in your numbers as far as the team metric goes did you see from BYU because of those two wins?
It's not just those two wins. It's really what they've done over the course of this month. I think about a month ago, I was looking at this team. They were kind of right outside the tournament picture. And based on their team performance so far in the year, I wasn't super optimistic that they were going to dramatically change their fortunes. It was kind of a 50-50 coin flip. I had them around 40th in the country about a month ago in terms of predicted team strength, but they are the hottest team in the Big 12 right now. They are more improved than any other team in the conference over the last month. They're up to the 24th best team in the country in terms of not just how good they've been so far this season, but what I'm predicting to them do going forward. Their offense in particular has absolutely come alive. They now have a top 15 offense in the country. They're comfortably in the field in terms of bracketology. And, you know, they've just done a lot of impressive work. That win against Kansas was big. The win on the road against Arizona was worth at least a seed bump, if not two, in terms of where they're going to end up in the tournament picture. So an absolutely massive, massive set of results for the BYU Cougars.
Okay, so we were talking to begin the show, which was the bigger deal? Was it the win where you blow out Kansas at home? Is it going on the road and getting the win over the higher-ranked team, getting the quad one road win? It sounds like the numbers say that maybe that Arizona win is the one that gave BYU the biggest jump then from an analytics standpoint.
In terms of their resume and how they're going to be seeded, the Arizona win matters a lot more because not only is Arizona seen as a stronger team, but this was on the road in a really, really tough environment. And so that's going to be a lot more in terms of their tournament outlook. In terms of how the analytics see them from a predictive sense, it's probably pretty similar. This Kansas team has been pretty lackluster recently. And yeah, BYU was not expected to beat the crap out of them. They were favored by a couple points in that game. So it was certainly a really big sign that they were able to do that. But also this Kansas team has been a little iffy recently. So in that sense, I think both wins are equally important based on just what we think about this team going forward. But from a resume perspective and how it's going to impact their seeding in the tournament, that win at Arizona really is the big one.
Evan Miyakawa. Check out evanmia.com for all of this numeric awesomeness is on BYU Sports Nation. Let's look at the Cougars a little more in-depth by the numbers in terms of what BYU does best. And then on the other side, where do you feel like they may need to shore up some things so that they can play better by the time they get to March?
Well, I think the thing that I have always loved about the squad from the preseason is there was a lot of talk about Yegor Demon coming in and being this big-time player. But when you looked at this roster from top to bottom, this team has more depth than any other team, arguably in the nation. When you look at my player ratings on my website right now at evanmia.com, where it ranks the value of every single player that they bring to their team, there is only one other team in the country that goes deeper in terms of their 9-man rotation than BYU based on value. It's only Gonzaga. So basically, BYU has the best or a top 2 9-man deep rotation. And that is a huge thing for them because they do not overly rely on one guy. And whether you're talking about your best player or your worst player, there's really not that big of a difference. And so they can really outlast teams because they just have a lot of different weapons that are really reliable. So when I look at this team's strength, their depth is that strength because it's one of the best, deepest units in the country. And you can honestly have a lot of argument about who their best player has been. Richie Saunders arguably has been that guy for them. You know, he's been really, really awesome. But you don't need him to have a great game in order to win. You don't need Yegor Demon to have a great game in order to win. There's a lot of different pieces. There's a lot of options and ways that you can dismantle an opponent. And so to me, that is the biggest strength. You could also twist that a little bit and say, what is their weakness? Well, they don't really have a star go-to player that maybe against a top 15, top 10 team in the country, you're going to be reliably able to put the ball in their hands and have them win the game for you every single night. You know, that player was supposed to be Demon. He's been as advertised as a playmaker, but his scoring has been a little bit underwhelming this season, and so that could be their weakness. But I see the depth more as a strength than a hindrance for this team.
Obviously, everybody's going to follow their individual team, but when you're in a conference, specifically one as great as a college basketball conference as the Big 12, you want the conference to do well. How is the Big 12 comparing to the other leagues?
The Big 12 this year has definitely taken a step back, especially when you compare it to the SEC, who has been unbelievable this year. Not only the best conference in the country, but arguably the best in the entire sport that we've seen in several years. And so for me, the thing is that the elite top end to this conference is still there. Houston is second in the country in terms of team rating right now at my website. They are one of the most likely teams to win a national title. Iowa State has been great. Texas Tech has come on late. And then you've got another crop of teams in like Arizona and BYU, and you can throw Kansas in there, who have legitimate Final Four hopes. But the bottom of the conference in the past used to be much better, where most of the teams here were looking at having tournament chances. And the reality is Oklahoma State, Colorado, UCF, TCU, you can throw Utah in there. They're just not quite in the same conversation. And so the bottom end has dropped off a little bit for this conference.
Is that, obviously there's going to be a lot of factors that go into that, but is that just sort of what happens sometimes when you expand by as many teams as the conference has?
Yeah, and the problem is that the teams that the Big 12 has added in previous years, you look at Houston, you look at BYU, even Arizona this year, these are teams that came into the conference already with a really high pedigree, tournament success, and have been major factors in their conferences. But then you add teams this year like, Arizona State and Utah, who were just not quite at the same caliber. And so they're just not going to really add that much, especially in a year like this when it's their first year in the conference and they're having a harder time adjusting than BYU has, for example. It's just a little bit harder, to kind of have those conferences or those new teams add something to the conference. You've seen this certainly as an issue with the ACC. All of the teams that the ACC has added this year, for the most part, have been huge bummers, and that's not helped their tournament cases hardly at all.
Evan Miyakawa, college basketball analytics expert, is on BYU Sports Nation. Okay, let's follow up that question with straight up, is the Big 12 the second toughest conference in America still, even though this has been a little bit of a downer, or are you giving that to the Big 10?
Right now on conference strength rankings on my website, the Big 12 has it over the Big 10 for the second best conference by just a hair. And I do think that largely is true. I think the Big 10, the thing that they have better than the Big 12 is more depth. They're going to probably have more teams in the tournament than the Big 12. But the problem is that the Big 10 does not have any really elite teams this year. We kind of knew that coming into this year, and there's not been a single team that has really risen above all of the rest to be firmly like in the top 5 conversation and nationally. Wisconsin has had moments, Purdue has had moments, Michigan State, Michigan, but they're all kind of, all very similar at the top there. And so I think that's what the Big 12 has over the Big 10 this year. And that's why I would also give the Big 12 more of an edge to get more teams to the Final Four and have a better chance of winning the national title.
Heading into this game Wednesday night at Arizona State, BYU comes in with an overall record of 19-8. They're 9-5 in the Big 12. What's your projected record for BYU by the end of the regular season?
Yeah, looking at their, the last several games in conference play, really the only one that's going to be a major hang-up is that game at Iowa State, which will be tough. But for all of those other games, the Arizona State game, I give BYU a 68% chance of winning that game, and then they have a game versus West Virginia and Utah at home, who they should handle if they're doing things well. So for this team, I think 3-1 in that stretch is very reasonable because they're going to be favorites in 3 of those games. But honestly, I think even if BYU goes 2-2 in that stretch, loses at Iowa State, maybe loses one other game, I still think they're going to be okay heading into the Big 12 tournament in terms of their tournament outlook. I think if they go 3-1, I don't know this for sure, but if they go 3-1, I would say at that point they're for sure a tournament lock, just because even if they lose their first game of the Big 12 tournament, I still think that this team is going to be comfortably in.
All right, Evan, I know the answer to this question because I'm looking at your website right now and I know the numbers, but I want you to reveal to the people here the answer to this question, and that is, who is BYU's best player right now?
BYU's best player on a per-possession basis based on the value they bring on the court. And I've mentioned this before, there's a lot of different players that can be in this conversation, but it is Fus Traore.
Let's go!
And Fus Traore, yeah. And he's been in this team for multiple years, and people have been kind of waiting for him to have this big season. I don't think this season has been about him more than it's just been about the collection of players that this team has. The best offensive player on this team in terms of the metrics is Richie Saunders, and it's just by a hair. But when you're looking at the full body of work, both offensively and defensively, Traore is number 1. But there's honestly a lot of players really close. Keba Keita is graded out as the team's best defender. He comes in at number 2. And then you've got Saunders, Dallin Hall, and Yegor Demmin kind of all right there. So the gap is really small. And honestly, if you look at this even in several days, that order could change.
Whether it's, and you can take your pick here, whether it's maybe a sleeper in the Big 12 itself or maybe just sort of a sleeper in college basketball, is there a team that maybe people don't necessarily think too highly of, but the numbers are saying this team's pretty good and you better watch out for them?
Well, listen, I've got a team in the Big 12, and this has been something I've been kind of tracking for a while, and people do not like it, but I am still high on the Kansas Jayhawks. The thing with this team is that they came in, obviously, preseason number 1 in the AP poll. They've obviously been massively disappointing, and they're not really in the running for a title like people thought. This team has been especially disappointing in the last month or so. They've really just kind of let themselves go. They've had a bad stretch of games here. Obviously, that humbling defeat at BYU is an example of that. But when you just kind of look on the merit of not just what they've done on the totality of their season, but also the roster talent that they have and the coach that they have in Bill Self and their tournament track record, all the signs still point that they are going to outperform what they've done so far down the stretch. And so I predict that this Kansas team will rebound, will be in much better shape for the tournament, and still has a chance of going to a Sweet 16 potentially. Obviously, there are some things for this team to work on, but despite the fact that they have been pretty bad recently, I still have them in terms of predicted team strength going forward as a top 20 team in the country. So I do think they're going to be better than they've been recently, and I think they're a good buy low candidate right now.
Evan, we'll finish with this. What can BYU do in their final 4 regular season games and the Big 12 tournament to jump up another seed line or 2, to get on that 6-7 line and avoid the 8-9 matchup?
I think if you go 3-1 down the stretch in the regular season and you pick up at least 1 game in the Big 12, I do think that will probably move them up a little bit because other teams around them will likely lose more games or lose in the first round of their conference tournaments. Honestly, a big separator that you often see for teams kind of in this on the right side of the bubble, but kind of in that 8 to 11 range, is that a lot of them kind of go into their conference tournaments and then, 50-50 chance they just lose their first game and they can't really do much. So just getting at least 1 win in your conference tournament really can do a lot. And sometimes that can be kind of spur you on to win another game or 2 and get to your semifinals or finals. So for this team, I think if they can get 4 more wins this season, including the regular season and the tournament, I think that'll probably move them even more in the right direction when the bracket comes out on Selection Sunday.
BYU basketball by the numbers with the fabulous Evan Miyakawa. EvanMia.com if you want more of that goodness. We appreciate the time as always, my friend. Good luck to you, and we hope you get some rest at some point over the next month.
The rest isn't coming for a while, and I love it that way.
Thanks, Evan.